May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight and in our hearing, O God, our rock and our redeemer. In the name of Christ we pray. Amen. Even as Chris has shared with us this morning, I think we've all had moments in our own lives where we have received a reward for something that we have worked hard for. Maybe it has been a high school or a college or a university degree. And sometimes those of you maybe who have done that even later on in life have appreciated even more. And the value of that reward, that diploma, that degree has given you something just deeply to rejoice in. Maybe it has been a trophy or a medal after winning a championship. Maybe it is even, in some ways, being recognized in your place of employment simply by a bonus, extra pay for working overtime, for working hard. Maybe it's a public recognition of a project or something that you have completed within the community that maybe benefits the larger community. I know I've been to a couple of your places, and some of you have been recognized publicly within Mississauga and outside of Mississauga for things that you have done. You use your talents and your gifts, and there's been a sense of that recognition and that reward. Some of you here is also a citizenship to a new country. Sometimes those of us who've lived here take that for granted, but really the hard work of moving from one country to Canada and receiving that citizenship and what that means. And here I'm just going to say this too. The last thing here is just maybe simply a smile from someone who maybe we have made a better day for. Amen? Yeah. So we've had all those moments, and we know how it makes us feel, and we know how that can motivate us in our living and in our lives, because there is something to be said for knowing that at the end of whatever we're doing, this hard work, this journey that we're on, maybe a project that we're doing, there is a reward. There is a part of us knowing that if we persevere, that there will be something that will be given to us in the end. Not just for ourselves. And here I'm not speaking selfishly, but I'm speaking just even for the benefits of others, for the benefit of the community as well. So in many ways, there's a little bit of an altruism there as well. Now, in our scripture reading today, we learn for the very first time that Paul expects his present circumstances, his imprisonment, in fact, to result in his death. It's maybe one of the most personal parts of 1st and 2nd Timothy that he writes to his friend, to his spiritual son in the faith. He is most likely, has been maybe even transferred to Rome. Scholars are not quite sure whether he was in Rome or not, but it's quite likely that he was in Rome. He was facing a preliminary trial under the Roman tribunal for preaching and teaching the gospel of Jesus, which at that time was outside of the jurisdiction of Rome. How Paul died is actually unknown, but it is believed. This is just what scholarship has suggested. It was believed that he was beheaded. Beheading meant that it was actually the right of a Roman citizen to be beheaded, as opposed to the lingering death of crucifixion. And it's quite possible that Paul knew that he was going to have to choose. And being a Roman citizen, this was an option for him, however tragic. And it was also possible that this was done maybe in the mid-60s under the Emperor Nero, who we know blamed the Christians in particular for some of the issues that were going on in Rome, and particularly even the Great Fire of Rome in the mid-60s in the 1st century. So in many ways, there's an irony here, and I don't know if you caught it even with that background as well too. There's this irony that Paul speaks about his impending death, but his anticipation of also receiving a crown of righteousness, similar to an athlete being given a laurel wreath after winning an Olympic event. And we'll get into that in a few minutes. But it is this that he sort of wants to impress upon Timothy. And I want you to sense the irony of these words as Paul is writing to it. And as we read it now, a little bit of the background, knowing what Paul is dealing with, imprisonment, also knowing what his possible death could actually be. Aren't these sort of interesting words that he writes to Timothy? And let's say them together. But as for you, keep your head in all situations. Endure hardship. Do the work of the evangelist. Discharge all the duties of your ministry. For I am already being poured out like a drink offering, and the time has come for my departure. Paul knows that it is time. There is a clock that is ticking in the background. And he uses, in fact, a reference from the Old Testament, this understanding of a drink offering. In the liturgy of Judaism, in the liturgy of the temple, there was a cup that was brought and was a part of the offering that was given to God. And in a sense, it was poured out in the sanctuary before God. And it was essentially an offering that I am giving all of myself to you, Lord. And what's interesting about this, too, and maybe Denise, if you can pop that back up on the screen just for a moment. That particular passage, Paul says this, and the key word here is that it's not that I'm going to be poured out, but he says I'm already being poured out. My time has come for my departure. And then, as we've heard this morning, he goes on to a chain of athletic metaphors that would be common to him, would be common to Timothy, would be common to the culture of his time and of his place, particularly in the Greco-Roman world. We sometimes think of the Apostle Paul as this great theologian and missionary, but I also like to think of Paul as a great sports fan. He actually, throughout many of his letters, uses sports analogies or the world of the athletic world of his time in order to sort of illustrate and to bring metaphor to his teaching. And he says these words, I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. And so Paul, in many ways, compares his life to an athletic event. He wants Timothy, and also vicariously us, he wants us to picture ourselves in a stadium. Maybe even within, and some of you have maybe been there, into an amphitheater, where there is an athletic contest that is taking place. The Greco-Roman world was famous for their love of athletics. And in fact, we know that they gave rise to the Olympic Games. Participants would come from all around the Mediterranean. They would train, they would invest, and then they would compete at a place called, Mount Olympus. It was the central and the biggest of all, and the grandest of all of the Olympic Games of that time. And it was also a very religious event. In the early Greek world, what would happen is that there would be even oaths and sacrifices that would be given to the great god of the Greeks, Zeus. And so you would have these events where the athletes would gather together, but then at the same time there was these offerings that were given even to and before the statue of Zeus. Now, what I have up on the screen for you, some ancient pottery that in fact depicted some of the events that took place in those Olympic Games. Ancient pottery that depicted equestrian events and of course, chariot races. There was also Greco-Roman wrestling. There was boxing. There was discus and javelin throwing. There was also the long jump. And of course, there was running, including the marathon, which was a part of a long-distance run that went back to a person, a Greek, who actually ran between one army and the other in order to relay a message. Now, my friends, Paul is not necessarily too specific here about what athletic event he is referring to, but we really do get the idea. And maybe it was indeed that he was identifying himself as a runner, as somebody who was running the race. I've been a contestant, he says, and I've been running the noblest and the biggest race of all, and that is the Christian life. I've been doing it in the honor and to the glory of Jesus Christ, my Savior and my Lord. And then the cool thing about this is that he says, even from a Roman prison cell, even dealing with his circumstances in life, what does he say about what is the adjective that he uses? Terrible? This has been awful? No, I have what? Fought the good fight. It has been all good, Timothy. The good here implies that Paul is not sort of saying, and he's not necessarily speaking about his own ability. He's not necessarily boasting and saying, well, look at all of these things that I've done, Timothy. And this is because I've done all of these things, this is my reward. I'm pretty sure that Paul knew who he was. In fact, he knew his history. And it wasn't all good, but he knows the grace and the favor of Jesus in his life. And he knows that at that point when he gave his life over to Christ, that he began to run a different race. And indeed, that grace of Jesus is what had saved him and kept him motivated to keep running. So here, for Paul, I think good means this. Despite where I'm at right now, there is a joy to my life. There is a gratitude to my life. There is a peace to my life because I'm seeing the bigger picture. If you like, the bigger stadium, the bigger amphitheater, the one who I am running for. And so even as he is facing his impending death, he can say, I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. He knows the clock is ticking. And don't we all know in our own lives, that proverbial clock is ticking in our life. And maybe here's the first thought maybe to leave with you this morning is, how would you describe your life? What is the metaphor that you use for your life? And as you're running this race, maybe you feel as if you're at the beginning. You just started, you're moving forward. Maybe you feel as if you're in the middle. And maybe you're sort of transitioning from the middle towards the end. There's days where I'm feeling a little bit more like that every morning. But anyways, we won't get into that. The clock is ticking. We know that it is there. So what metaphor are you using? How could you describe your own life? Here's an interesting story. In the 1968 Mexico Olympic Games, there was a marathon runner from Tanzania who came limping into the stadium an hour after the winner had crossed the line. His name was actually John Stephen Akware, and he was the last man to finish the marathon. And you can see by the picture here, his leg was bloodied, it was bandaged. He'd actually taken a bad fall early in the race. And now it was all that he could do, simply even to get into the stadium and to limp around the track. And in fact, many of the crowd, you can see in the background, a lot of the crowd had left the stadium. They were on their way out. But here was this runner from Tanzania, and he wanted to complete the race. And those who were there stood and applauded as he completed the last lap. Now, it was interesting, after the race, there was one person who bravely asked him maybe this question, and maybe the question that everyone was wondering, why did you decide to finish the race? Why didn't you just quit after you had fallen and had been badly hurt? Why didn't you simply give up? And Akware, with really a very quiet dignity, said this. And maybe it's one of the more memorable statements, even in history, with regards to the Olympic Games. He said this: "My country did not send me 7,000 miles to start this race.